Sounds good. Good evening. My name is Jade Decker, and I am the Director of Communications of Reform Elections Now, a nonpartisan association of mostly Harvard Business School alumni. We were initially motivated by business executive Catherine Gell and Harvard professor Michael Porter, whose thesis claims the government is too polarized to get anything done. In fact, it is this polarization that has caused the United States to lag behind many developed countries in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and crime. It is our belief that we need election process innovation if we hope for any sort of remedy to this serious problem. The United States is a democracy and a republic and was founded with a balance between the rights of the federal government and those of the states. It seems like this balance has begun to unravel with recent court case decisions termed by jurists as the independent state legislature construct of the Constitution, giving more power to the states. In today's event, we will cover a range of issues related to federal, state, and individual rights. However, instead of giving you our opinions, we are going to ask you for yours. There will be approximately 30 questions to help you and us decide an appropriate balance between federal and state rights. Our team has been working for 3 years to understand and to educate ourselves and others on how to include engagement as part of our civic responsibilities. Our association is made up of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, but we work together as a team to seek improvements in American democracy. Our core team members consist of Michael Otten, Herb Kaplan, Lucy Kennedy, Ron Randall, Bill Rosser, Robin Weaver, Harry Nam, and our wonderful Director of Research, Peter Cyrus, without whom this presentation would not be possible. We hope you will join us in the future months as we continue to explore ways to improve election processes, make government work better for all people, and uncover common misconceptions held about government or election processes. If you would like to be more involved with our association, we invite you to reach out to us at reformelectionsnow@gmail.com. As we move forward with this discussion, please keep your microphone muted to avoid background noise unless making a comment to the group. I now turn the meeting over to Peter Cyrus, who will take us through should the federal government or states rule.
Thanks, Jade. And not to nitpick, but it's been 4 years or more. God, it seems like a decade. And I'd like to call out Allegra Klein, who is a new member of our team and without whom we couldn't get the presentation up on the screen. Thank you, Allegra.
My pleasure.
So the topic today is democracy or republic. Is the balance between the federal government and the states becoming unraveled? Next. So the United States, as Jade said, is part democracy and part republic. The founding fathers tried to strike a balance between the rights of the federal government and those of the states. But now it seems as if the balance is becoming unraveled. Recent court decisions on gerrymandering and voting rights have focused on what jurists term the independent states' legislative construction of the Constitution, giving more power to the states. These rulings have been hailed by the right and sent the left into apoplexy. The power between the federal government and the states is being tested every day in many different ways. All you have to do is look at the buses and planes of undocumented industries undocumented immigrants, being transported from red states to blue. Adjudicating the balance between the states, federal, and individual rights is a highly complex problem, which is not Republican or Democratic, and which may have more middle ground than either side would dare to admit. Next. So, as Jade said, in this presentation, we're going to consider the balance between these rights, but this presentation is about you and your views. We will be asking questions on specific issues related to state and federal rights. You will vote, and any conclusions will be based on what you, not we, say. You will have a short time, less than 10 seconds, to answer each question, so don't get hung up on it. Just cast your vote when you see it on the screen. Questions will cover personal rights, marriage, guns, abortion, immigration, and election rules. So let's get ready to answer. Next. Okay, part one is laws relating to individuals. And we're going to look first at speed limits on interstate highways. Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming have speed limits up to 80. Texas has it up to 85. Whereas Alaska, Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Vermont have maximum speed limits of 65, and Hawaii is only 60. Who should determine the speed limits on interstate highways? The federal government or the individual states? Cast your votes. Okay, vote closed. Herb, you got answers? So 92% say that's a state decision. 8% say federal. Great, next. Next slide. Oop. Who should determine drinking ages in each state? The federal government or the states? Okay. Close vote. Interesting. Closer margin than the one before. Now, this is actually a trick question. And the reason it's a trick question is every state has a drinking age of 21. Now, how can states which can't agree on anything agree on drinking age? Simple. In 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act. States did not have to abide by this law, but if they did not, they would not receive federal highway funding. Given a choice, states took the money. Interesting to question whether this funding model could be used for other issues like same-sex marriage or abortion or something like that. Next slide. Now, although all states choose to accept the National Drinking Age Act, most found some loopholes. 29 allowed drinking at home. 29 allowed drinking at home if parents say it's okay. 10 allowed drinking if minors are out to a meal with parents. 11 allow hospitality students to drink in school, because how are you going to test the wine if you can't drink? And 24 states prohibit a minor from drinking in church or at Seder. Now, is banning a teenager from drinking in church or at a Seder a violation of the First Amendment freedom of religion? Okay, let's see how people voted. Interesting. So 57% say it's a violation of freedom of religion, but 43 say it's not. So those 43, you better, if you're Jewish, you better make sure your kid isn't drinking at a Seder, and if you're a Christian, you better watch them at communion. Okay, next. Now, most states set the marriage age at 18, but a few have some different ages. With parental consent, some states allow marriage at 16 or 17. Mississippi allows females to marry at 15, while Maryland allows females to marry at 15 if they are pregnant or have given birth. So who should decide the marriage age? Federal government, states, or individuals? Okay, get your vote in. Let's see what the answer is. Okay, so 44% states, 32 and 24% individuals. Interesting. Now, 20 states or territories have rules permitting people to marry their first cousins. Should marrying your first cousin be legal? Yes or no? Okay. Okay, people don't think the majority doesn't think people should marry their first cousin. Okay. Now, here's an extra question. Are the states that allow cousins to marry primarily Democratic or Republican? Let's get the vote out here. Okay. 68% say these states are basically Republican, all those places in the South where, cousins are getting married in West Virginia and stuff like that, right? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's a surprise. Almost all the states, a vast majority of the states that allow cousins to marry are blue states. There are very few red states, a couple of purple states, and 5 more states allow first cousins over 50 to marry. So most of you are wrong on where states that allow first cousins to marry. Next slide. Okay. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. Yet, interestingly, 29 states still have constitutions that ban same-sex marriage. Who should decide the rules for same-sex marriage? The federal government, states, or individual? Okay, we got our votes. Okay, so 19% individuals, most people think the federal government, 65%. Okay, let's go to the next question. Loving versus Virginia protected interracial marriage. Should there be a legal distinction between same-sex and interracial marriage? Let's get the vote up. Okay. Okay, 80% say interracial marriage should be the same as same-sex. Now, for those who may have missed the news today, Clarence Thomas read Ginny's testimony in front of the January 6th Commission and came out against interracial marriage. I don't know if you saw that news, but if the Supreme Court overturns Loving versus Virginia, would Clarence Thomas still be married to Ginny? And the second question is, would he be happier? Now, you don't have to answer these questions because when we see Thomas's vote on this issue, we'll know what the answer is. Next. Okay. If the argument for same-sex and interracial marriage is that the government should not interfere with a person's personal choices, then what about polygamy? Assume 2 brothers live on a farm. One dies and the other offers to assume the responsibility for the brother's wife and their children, and both women approve. Should the husband be able to marry his brother's wife? So the question is, shouldn't polygamy also be protected by the Constitution? Okay. So it's interesting. 70% say that it should not be protected from the Constitution. So you're going to have this family with the brother and the brother's wives, and when the surviving brother passes away, when they go to pay taxes, they get the other spouse has to file separately. They don't get any of the protections that a married couple would get. Just interesting. That's how people are voting. Next page. Okay, now we're going to ask about moving between states. A 15-year-old gives birth to a child in Maryland, weds the child's father, and moves across the street to Pennsylvania, where minors cannot marry. Or 60-year-old first cousins who are married in New Mexico move across the street to Texas, where cousins cannot marry. Should these marriages be legal in the new state? Okay, so 100% of the people say that even though in the state in which they have moved says this marriage is illegal, the fact that they got married in another state where it was legal should hold the day. Next page. Okay. The Second Amendment protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms, but states have very different gun laws relating to the age of the buyers, waiting time, purchase requirements, permits for concealed carry, open carry, campus carry, licensing of dealers, and regulations on assault weapons. Now, an 18-year-old New Hampshire resident brings an assault weapon to her freshman dorm at Harvard, where assault weapons are illegal. I mean, they're not only illegal at Harvard, they're illegal in Massachusetts. Is she breaking the law? So interestingly, 86% of you say that she's breaking the law from carrying a gun that she bought legally in New Hampshire into Massachusetts. But 100% of you said that the family that moves into a state where their marriage would be illegal is not breaking the law. Just making a point here. Was your answer the same as on marriage? Obviously not. So you basically said bringing a marriage across state lines was legal, but bringing a gun was not. Next. Okay. Marijuana. Marijuana is legal in most states, but illegal federally. Under federal law, federally chartered banks and credit card companies cannot do business with marijuana dispensaries, meaning dispensaries are usually paid in cash. As a result, marijuana dispensaries have the highest burglary rate of any business. According to Wharton, 1 in every 2 cannabis dispensaries were robbed or burglarized, while in Denver, cannabis dispensaries make up 1% of local businesses, but account for 10% of all burglaries. Does it make sense for something to be illegal nationally, but legal in specific states? Okay, we got answers. So 2/3 of you said no. But the question is, how do we resolve this conflict? I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to buy marijuana and pulled out your American Express or Visa card, or tried to write a check from the Chase Manhattan Bank, JP Morgan Chase, or whatever it's called. It don't work. So this is a very interesting issue that creates extra crime because it's illegal federally. Next. Abortion. Okay. Prior to Roe v. Wade, only 4 states allowed abortion. Now the decisions are back in the hands of the states. Should abortion be regulated by the states, the federal government, or neither? Okay, so 50% say individuals, and the states and the federal split. Very interesting answer. Now, supposing the federal government banned abortion, should states be able to legalize it? Interesting. 59% say yes, 41% no. So if the federal government banned abortion, 41% basically say that's the law of the land. Now, if Congress passed a compromise law banning abortion after 22 weeks, would states have to comply? So let's say a state passed a law that said a woman has the right to abortion, but at any time, but Congress passed a law saying after 22 weeks, would the states have to comply? So 68% basically say that's the law of the land. Okay. Since now some of the states have passed laws saying that if somebody travels to another state to get an abortion, they're breaking the law and can be arrested. Since Congress regulates interstate commerce, could it pass a law prohibiting a state from punishing a resident that crossed lines for an abortion? Okay. Yes, 74% no, 26%. Let's go to the next slide. There's only one small problem. There's something called the U.S. Constitution. Article 4, Section 2 requires that a person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime who shall flee from justice and be found in another state shall, on demand of the executive authority of the state which he fled, be delivered up to be removed to the state having the jurisdiction of the crime. I know that sounds complicated, but that's how those guys wrote it in those days. And they only mentioned he, not she. But thus, a law to protect women traveling across state lines for an abortion would be struck down because it conflicts with the U.S. Constitution. If you wanted, it would take a new constitutional amendment to allow that. Next. Okay, now we're going to talk about immigration. So the federal government sets the rules for immigration, but the impact of immigration differs significantly between the states. In 2015, there were 10,700,000 undocumented immigrants in the United States, and 36% were in Texas and California. 87% were in 11 states. And 40% of the costs of supporting undocumented immigrants were incurred by California, Texas, and New York. The bottom 24 states only incurred 5%. So if the federal government sets immigration policies, shouldn't it compensate the states for their expenses on undocumented immigrants? We got Herb. Okay, so 95% think the federal government, they're letting them in, they should pay. Next slide. If the federal government does not reimburse states, if they don't listen to this group, should states with a higher burden from undocumented immigrants have the right to establish their own policies? Okay, number one, should states have the right to transport undocumented immigrants to other states as Texas and Florida have done? Okay. So 2/3 of you say the immigrants come to Texas, they come to Arizona, they come to New Mexico, they come to California. Those states are stuck with them. We're not going to send them to Nantucket to help Ken harvest the scallops. Okay. Can states deny undocumented immigrant services such as medical care or education? Okay. Interesting split. Almost half and half. Okay. Should states, given that the states have no hand in this and it's costing them money, should states be able to return undocumented immigrants to their countries of origin? Interesting. More than half of you think that if Florida, Texas, Arizona, whatever, they don't want those immigrants, they can send them back to Venezuela or Nicaragua or wherever they come from. Good. I don't mean good. I agree. I mean, it's an interesting answer. Next. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about elections quickly. The Constitution lays out broad rules for the election of presidents and members of Congress. Most states have similar systems, but a few have created their own versions, like Maine, which has ranked choice voting. Maine and Alaska, Washington, California, and Louisiana have adopted top two nonpartisan primaries for federal elections. So should states have the right to create their own election systems for federal offices? Okay. Okay, so more than 2/3 of you think that states should have to create their own election systems. Next. Now, presidential elections are decided by the Electoral College. 48 states give their votes to the winner for the state, but Maine and Nebraska allocate electoral votes largely by congressional district. Should this be allowed? Okay, so 2/3 of you think this is fine. Now let's try if, just as an observation, if in 2020, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, Minnesota, and Arizona had decided for political expediency to switch to the system used in Maine and Arizona, Trump would have won the election. So should states be able to switch systems back and forth based on political expediency? No. Okay, 100% no. Next slide. Now, there are a few rules for the way states draw election districts. The U.S. Constitution requires that each district have about the same population. It seems simple, but things could change. For example, Trump wanted the census to count only citizens and exclude illegal immigrants. If you excluded illegal immigrants, representation for many urban areas would decline sharply. States have discussed alternative voting systems for counting only voting age population or citizen voting age population. And given the current leaning of the Supreme Court, it is possible that one or more states could attempt to employ this type of system. Should states have the right to draw district plans based on different definitions of the population? Again, no, very interesting, 100% no. Okay, next. Now, the Constitution requires that district lines cannot be drawn to harm voters based on race or ethnicity. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was designed to combat discrimination tactics denying minorities the right to an effective vote. This act, which created majority-minority districts, nullified many state laws. In the past 60 years, the white non-Hispanic percentage of the US population has dropped from 85.4% to 57.8%. Now, interestingly, minority candidates win elections from majority-minority districts by more than twice the margin in an average district, meaning that they may actually be underrepresented. In Shelby versus Holder, the Supreme Court struck down many of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Now, the question is, should Congress pass an amended law protected minorities, or should states have the freedom to draw their own districts? Okay. So 80% say that the federal government should pass an amended Voting Rights Act. What's interesting is that the current Voting Rights Act with majority-minority districts probably leaves minorities underrepresented rather than overrepresented. Next slide. Gerrymandering. In the past, courts have rejected some of the most racially biased gerrymandering, but a current case in front of the Supreme Court, Moore versus Harper, could give states more rights to gerrymander congressional districts for political purposes. Assuming the Supreme Court rules in favor of the independent state law doctrine, should Congress pass legislation to define rules of drawing districts? This is a new question. Can we get the new question up? There. Okay, so almost everybody thinks that Congress should set the rules for congressional election districts. Next. The use of independent commissions to draw election districts appears to result in less gerrymandering, more balanced elections, and more moderation. Should Congress have the right to mandate that all congressional districts be drawn by independent commissions? Very interesting. 84% of you think that states should have, that Congress should mandate independent commissions. Now, would many current members of Congress vote for a law creating commissions that could cost them their jobs? Now, I didn't put yes or no. You don't have to answer the question. The question's too obvious. I mean, these Congress people like keeping their jobs. They like the gerrymandering. Next. Should states have the right to create their own voting rules for mail-in voting, number of voting places by population, early voting periods, and other aspects of voting? Or should the federal government establish uniform rules for voting across all states? Okay, 72% of you think the federal government should have uniform rules. Now, what's interesting is some states like Utah, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Hawaii have all mail-in votes. So if a federal law created universal standards, these states would have to change their systems back because the federal government wouldn't approve all mail votes for primaries, for elections, I'm sorry. So would it be beneficial if under the federal laws that you all supported, that some of the states had to roll back some of the things that they've done? Herb, yes, thank you. Okay, we got votes. So exactly 50-50 split. Okay, next slide. Should the federal, no, I think we skipped the, when we go, is this the next slide? Yes, okay. Should the federal government mandate that all citizens have a valid national voter ID card? Okay. 71% says yes. Now, should the federal government create a national voter registry to ensure that people don't vote in multiple states? Interesting. 80% say yes. Just for the record, if you have a house in New York and you have a second home in Florida and you voted in both states, nobody would ever know. Next slide. Should the federal government have the power to modify voting actions by a state that it believes discriminates against a particular group of voters? Okay, now the question is, and I won't ask it, but the question, 2/3 of you think yes. The question is, how are you going to determine that? And is that politicizing a particular election or not? But anyway, should the federal government conduct an audit of every election? Next, answers. So interestingly, even though corporations get their books audited every year and more than half of you say that every election, that there's no need for an official audit. Last question, I think, should the federal government select the auditors or leave it up to states who might pick cyber ninjas? So people think, a lot of you don't think the federal government should do an audit, but those of you think that that the federal government should at least pick the auditor. Next. So the last slide is the Supreme Court and the independent states' legislative construction of the Constitution voting rules. There's a typo there, sorry. Assume the conservative majority on the Supreme Court essentially rules that all elections should be decided by states, giving the states the right to draw election districts, set voting rules, disqualify voters based on their own rules, and allocate election votes based on the will of the governor and the state's legislature. This is, in essence, the independent states' legislative construction of the Constitution, where the states, not a majority of the people, rule. If the Supreme Court ruled in this manner for these things, what would happen to our democracy and our country? Now, you don't have to answer this question, but you do have to think about it because it could happen. Next. So, there was one last. So as we said at the start of this presentation, we cannot give you our conclusions until we review your answers. In many instances, there are great advantages to allow states to develop different systems. States started ranked choice voting, top 2 primaries. States can be good laboratories from which other states can learn. But in other states, in other cases, citizens need to be protected from a potentially extreme government in an individual state imposing draconian rules on its citizens. We're going to tabulate all your votes and send you the results. We do know there are no simple and easy answers to the issues of federal, state, and individual rights. However, we believe the balance between federal and state power will be the most significant political issue of the next decade. So now we will open the call to comments and discussion. Thank you.
I think there's been some very interesting comments in the chat too, which you could take a look at, particularly the question of a crime being committed. It's not a crime in the other state, therefore not necessarily having that a constitutional provision apply, as an example. So we definitely have some lawyers in this group, but it's fascinating how many of the splits on these answers are quite a bit, 50-50 or quite a few on every answer. There wasn't much consensus. Who else would like to comment?
If you want to comment, just raise your hand or speak up.
It's a small enough group so you can just unmute your microphone and contribute.
Okay. I have a comment. I thought that some of the questions were badly worded in the sense that, Peter, you would give us an instance. You would give us an example of the way a certain law might work. But clearly that wasn't the only thing that that law might do. So, it was very difficult to vote a yes or a no on questions like that, because perhaps you might vote yes, I would like the law to work that way, but you knew that such a law would, in other cases, not work the way you wanted it to. So I had trouble with some of the questions in that sense.
I
I
understand that, and I thought about it when I wrote the questions, and the whole point, I think, Mary Jane, is to show that these issues are so obtuse and complicated that there's no easy way to phrase. There's no easy way to phrase some of them, and that's what leads to a lot of the disputes that we have.
And there's no easy way to make a law.
Yes, yes, that's exactly correct.
Yeah. I just observed one of my own inconsistencies, which was that I said, I absolutely want different states to be allowed to have different ways of counting votes, reform efforts and innovation, so that we have the benefit of many trials of things, at the same time as saying that I did not want the states to have control over the definition of who gets to vote. Ultimately, I think that there are underlying principles that would explain that I'm not actually on two different sides of a fence.
Mhm.
But what it points out is you have to go down to some base principles about which things are federally should be determined by federal mandate, and which things. But what I would say, one principle would be try to minimize that so that you allow for successful innovation across the 50 different or more than 50 different venues.
Yeah, I mean, I think you explained it very well. The problem is that, innovation is good. I mean, we sit here giving presentations on ranked choice voting, on top two primaries, on nonpartisan primaries, on on all mail-in voting. We're giving these presentations. The benefit of having 50 states is that it can be a laboratory to see new and better ways. The negative is that some of the states can take the rules and twist them. And how Congress deals with those things in this kind of politicized environment is very complicated.
Some of these solutions, like the universal ID, seems to be a solution where there's no problem. And because there has been no evidence of widespread misuse of or the lack of ID has not been a problem. Also, the business of creating whether the feds should mandate rules. If they're restrictive, I think they can be countermanded, like having one drop-off box in the Houston area. I mean, that's an abomination. Whereas if Hawaii wants to do all mail-in voting, that's not restrictive, so that should be allowed. So I think there can be a floor that the feds can establish, but anything that the states do to make, like I think Oregon had all mail-in.
Correct.
And the motor voter provisions, anything that makes it less restrictive should be allowed, and anything which countermands the minimum standards of the feds should not be.
So were you saying, I just want to understand, on the issue of voter ID, were you saying that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I don't think there's a problem. It's an answer to a non-problem.
Okay, and I will just mention to you that there are many states, North Dakota, for example, passed a law that said, and several other states did as well, two things. One is you had to have a street address to be able to vote.
No, Native Americans have street addresses.
Correct. And no Native Americans have street addresses. So that left and Native Americans had to be able to prove when their families came to this country. Okay.
Oh my God. That's
no.
amazing.
Okay. So it's so you may say that there's no problem, but if you go on to the res and see the 8% total voting, because people's IDs aren't being accepted.
Now
I
we're,
guess they don't have street addresses.
Harvey and I just, we are ready to deposit our mail-in ballots. He can't put both of ours in the box. That it has to be signed. I mean, you know, there's something your 90-year-old grandmother fills out a ballot. You know, somebody, her nephew should be able to drop it in the box.
Right.
Actually, just to disagree with Jane, there's a value to universal ID as a resident of Florida because it removes from the state the ability to enact even more punitive barriers to voting. See, if you had a universal ID that I think would buy credibility for that there is a protection. But the other point I wanted to make, for some reason I couldn't start my video. I don't mean to keep you all in the dark. Hopefully my comments will remove that. What I found interesting about this quiz is we're trying to avoid that our opinions drive our answers, that our partisan opinions drive our answers. And at least if we're more informed about the Constitution or the Supreme Court doctrine of stare decisis, on two issues, voting rights, because of my either reading about Shelby versus Holder, equal protection, as well as reproductive rights, I felt like I had a compass to go to, but with others, I didn't really. So when it got to like, you know, in the Constitution that it sets that the states can determine the method of voting and the times, et cetera. I think that's in the Constitution. But what we're aware of is how that's been abrogated to deny the right to vote. So it seems like the more informed we are, which is like civics about the Constitution, as well as Supreme Court precedent when it's respected, it seems like then we can avoid bias from our partisan opinions. So.
Well, it's interesting, Eileen, because that gets back to something Jane talked about with one voting box, you know, in one drop box in Houston.
Yeah.
You know, does it, you know, how do you balance, you know, one system versus another?
But that would be discriminatory, just as the Florida rules, Jane, you know, basically the League of Women Voters will pay a felony charge of $50,000 if they harvest more than 2 votes other than a family member. You know, that is a solution in search of a problem, you know, and that minimizes voting, education, and participation. But the reason I objected about the universal ID, I remember when I voted in Iowa after moving from New York City in 2008, and I said, my God, Osama bin Laden could have voted in this caucus because there was no checking of your registration or anything. So I think if you could use the federal government to establish a threshold, perhaps that would buy credibility. That could be good, and that's a case. So
Speaking
We
of
did have
Florida, what's going to happen?
one person had her hand up and put it down. I don't know if the question got answered. Lois, you're still up there. Good. If you can unmute.
Thank you. Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I agree with some people who say that some questions could have been worded better, but I also understand that we don't want to get into too much complexity and we have limited time and things like that. You know, like some questions mentioned elections and like what elections, you know, just like maybe simple things like that. And also asking, should this be legal? Should this be illegal? I wasn't really clear on whether we're voting according to our personal values or according to what we really think is legal or illegal according to existing laws. But, you know, that to say, I think this was a really good exercise and to get us thinking about things a little more and how these different parts interrelate and to check the consistencies of our values. and our beliefs. So I think whoever put this together and, like the people behind it, overall, it was good. But there is something that doesn't really line up for me here. The premise, like one of the foundational statements, was the United States is part democracy, part republic. There wasn't any information given to support that claim. I guess a lot of people take it for granted. But at the very, oh, well, perhaps with the exception that it was followed by the sentence, the founding fathers tried to strike a balance between the federal government and the state government. So like maybe that might be interpreted to imply that republic, democracy, federal state, although I don't think it really does. But the founding fathers spoke against democracy, and none of the founding documents mentioned democracy. And James Madison, in one of the Articles of Confederation, distinguished a democracy and republic and said, like, democracy is flawed in these ways. This is a republic, this is different. So I don't really understand why we are saying that the United States is part democracy, part republic, when that's not supported by any of the founding documents or the founding fathers. Okay, so that's my comments and questions.
Let me respond to two things you said. First, we have never before tried to have a presentation with questions. So this was an experiment for us. And we just wanted to see, how it would work. We thought this was an interesting issue and wanted to see everybody's opinions. And as far as the difference between the democracy and between a democracy and a republic, the way at least we were thinking about it is a democracy is something where the majority rules, and a republic is a confederation of states. And there's a balance, people talk about the electoral college versus, who won the majority of the vote in the presidential election. We've had, 5, 6 elections in presidential history where one candidate won the majority of the popular vote and the other candidate won, the electoral college. And your points about James Madison, the founding fathers clearly wanted to have more power with the states and less power with the federal government. And for a long time, the movement was more power to the federal government, and now it's swinging back to more power to the states. So these are very complicated issues. And I apologize if the questions were worded in a way that confused some people.
Thank you, but I don't think my question was answered. What makes the United States part democracy?
Well, do you think the United States is part democracy? Let me ask you.
Oh, well, there are some democratic elements, but I would not call it a democracy.
Well, I think part of the answer is that it started out as more of a pure republic, where it was very much inclined towards states having the power. And it's evolved, and some of the amendments to the Constitution did add democratic components that weren't in the original Constitution, but by amendment became part of the Constitution. So we've been tending towards a more democratic environment, although, as Peter pointed out, I think we may be, it may not be a simple sense of one direction. It sort of varies over time.
But your point, actually, that would have been a good question. Is the United States a democracy or a republic? It would have been very interesting to see what people would have said.
Peter, what about the fact that just the fact that there's a vote or there are votes where in that vote, the majority wins that vote. Now it gets complicated in presidential elections with the Electoral College, but in the narrow election, wherever it occurs, the majority wins.
That's a democracy, but in terms of the way decisions get made, you know, it's much more, as Lois was pointing out, it's much more of a republic than it is a democracy. But I suspect if you asked a majority of Democrats, they would raise their hand and say this is a democracy. And as Lois was suggesting, maybe it's not. I see a hand up from a Thomas Rothschild.
Yeah, I was thinking along similar lines. And it's true that initially the states were the primary unit, and the federal government had representatives from the states, but had limited direct power. But I think it's important to recognize that that's changed, as was said a few minutes ago, primarily by the 14th Amendment and the other Reconstruction amendments, which were specifically designed to empower individuals as such. And so that's where a lot of this flux is centered, and a lot of the arguments that are being made now really are around the importance of the 14th Amendment. And certainly from a legal point of view, the 14th Amendment supersedes anything that is contrary to it.
Right.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it always turns out that way in how laws are enacted or interpreted or matters are decided. I did want to comment briefly on one other piece, and that was the abortion question about somebody who goes someplace else to have an abortion. I don't think they committed a crime in their home state. The home state says you can't have an abortion, but you're governed by the law of where you are. And so I don't think there's any way that they can either be required, that is, arrested and brought back, rendered to the initial state, because there was no crime there. And I don't think the state would have a right to prosecute based on a crime committed elsewhere.
But they have. There have been instances already where states which recently passed laws have arrested people who've gone to other states and come back. Now, you're probably right. You may be right that if that goes to the Supreme Court, it may be overturned. But
well, of course, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't states that have acted contrary to that. I think, I mean, no one knows what this court will do, but it would be very, very strange if the court said, yes, you can be arrested for a crime committed in another state. And that goes also to the question of marriage, in which the law is pretty well established that if you were legally married someplace, every other state must recognize that marriage. And that's also part of the original Constitution, by the way. So that in theory, if you lived in a state, or even if you lived in a country where polygamy was permitted, and you came to the US, that marriage would have to be recognized. And I think that's part even of what happened around the admission of Utah and the question of the doctrines of the Church of Latter-day Saints.
Well, two
Because
things.
they were required to give up polygamy first.
Right.
I think that's one
They
of the
were,
reasons.
that's right. They were required to give up polygamy as a condition of entering the union. But Allegra, you have a comment on if you're in a country with polygamy and you move to the United States, you want to make your comment?
Sure, yeah. So in predominantly Muslim countries where polygamy is permitted, usually it's up to 4 wives because that's the allowance under Muslim religion. What happens when, let's say, a man with 2 wives wants to immigrate to the United States, and let's say he has children with both of them, only one of them is allowed to come in, and the law is very clear on that. So this is just a devil's advocate, but are we trying to break up families who want to come and move to the United States because there is no protection for a second wife? Only one person can come in and under the law. And that also raises the question of freedom of religion. If practicing your religion in this country includes polygamy, is that not allowed? And how does that impinge upon our right to practice freedom of religion?
I see Ken has his hand up and Lionel has his hand up.
I'm sorry, I missed the name of the woman who made the statement about that she didn't believe that the US was a democracy or worse.
That was
to
Lois.
effect. Maybe
Lois.
Lois. So I'd like to know what Lois thinks, which countries, if any, today are a democracy.
I do not know the answer to that question. I don't know of any countries.
It's sometimes alleged that Switzerland is a democracy, but they don't have secret ballots either. So that's got some interesting aspects to it.
Yeah, so that's the question of what do we mean by democracy? Because I don't think there are countries, any country that allows, for instance, direct votes on enacting laws. So we have the idea of a representative democracy. And so then you have the question of definition.
But,
That's called a republic.
but I would
No, I'm not
submit,
sure of that.
I would argue that those countries like Scandinavia, for instance, just to begin with, don't have the situation that we have, where in a presidential election, if you live in North Dakota, your vote counts for 40 times the vote of a person who lives in California. How can we possibly call that a democracy? And maybe there are no perfect democracies, but certainly many countries get a lot closer than we do.
Well, I think Tom's comment is a representative democracy, and I also noticed a comment in the chat from Hamid that points out that California has all these propositions that actually are, so there are different versions of democracy. In California, you have a slightly purer form of democracy than you may have in other states.
I should have
Lionel,
thought of that since I live in California.
Oh, you do? Okay. Lionel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, if I can comment, first of all, this issue of democracy and the republic, Ben Franklin defined us as a republic, very, very, very simply. But I think we use the term democracy fairly loosely. For example, if I were to ask you, is Great Britain a democracy or something else? Most people would say it's a democracy, even though it's a kingdom, etc. So I don't think we ought to get hung up on what exactly a democracy is. The Greeks originally defined it as in-person voting on everything, which obviously we are not, and no country in the world is. So we can't define it that literally. But we are a republic. We are a representative democracy. We've used all those terms. And I don't think we ought to get hung up on that.
But if there's an ideal of each individual's voice having some value, then the North Dakota and South Dakota having the same number, each having a senator, the same number of
Yeah,
senators.
certainly stretches it,
California.
no question about
You
that.
know, there are ways to move, I think,
Yeah.
to a more representative, to a more equal democracy.
Yeah.
What's going to happen in Florida, where people don't have, I mean, in the Fort Myer, that whole area there's been so little written about that, the implications for the election of people losing everything.
Why don't we have someone from Fort Myers comment on that, Eileen?
That's actually interesting. It's as much of the tension that we've seen tonight, given that the four most hard-hit counties, Lee, Charlotte, go heavily for DeSantis. So already he's been thinking of changing the laws that where you would just, maybe have more early voting, maybe more mail-in voting, all the things that led to the fraud that wasn't the fraud. So it's definitely a tension. But the thing, I'll disagree with Lionel in that the essence of this is there's a lot of tension between the original founders and then the amendments that Mike sought, that talked about, or sorry, that Mike addressed. And there was a really excellent series in the Times a couple of weeks ago, which is that it all worked all right, this tension between republic and democracy, until demographic changes really affected things that it's hard to even represent equally. And then also the partisan nature of the Supreme Court, that we really are a minority majority in a lot of ways because of the Senate issue and because of the Supreme Court being more partisan. So that's not a solution, but it's a shame we don't have better civics education, because I've only become more educated on this through this group about what is a republic, what is a democracy. So
incidentally, we've been working to reform the Electoral Count Act of 1887, but the failed election law of 1845, which is part of this, part of what we're working to rewrite, basically said, going back to Fort Myers, if there's a if there's a natural disaster, or if the Pony Express rider got shot, riding from Tucson to Phoenix, then the legislature could simply decide how the election worked out. If something happened that votes didn't get delivered when they should be, when they were supposed to have, they could just, the state legislature and the governor have the right to basically say, hey, we know there were a lot of people in Fort Myers who would have voted for DeSantis. So, we're just declaring the election for DeSantis. And that's actually still part of the law.
Well, I think we've gone over time today, but I think it's been well worthwhile, and I think everyone would agree it's been a very educational session, recognizing how complex some of these issues that the media tends to oversimplify, and of course the polarization has tended also to oversimplify, as Jane pointed out, when it comes to just how much fraud there might have been or not been. But certainly there are a lot of people that think there was a fraud. And sometimes you have to do things to improve trust, even if there's not a basis for it. So I think we raised a lot of good questions. Had some excellent discussion. I'm really glad that you all could attend. And I do think we'll try to send out to you a summary of the results, because it's also instructive how many people or how often the votes were split on things that would seem like you'd want to have clear answers to. Peter, do you have any wrap-up points you'd like to?
I found first, I apologize to those of you who were confused about the questions. I'll learn how to write better questions in the future. And we were just, as Jane just said, what we were trying to accomplish today was to provoke thoughts. We were trying to be thought-provoking and not necessarily. Today, the idea was not to end up with some hard answers. The idea was to get everybody to think about things. So I thank everybody for coming.